Welcome to episode 6 of 21 in 21. I have today with me, it's a privilege for me. I've known this gentleman for a long time. I'll be talking with Drummond Reed, who is the Chief Trust Officer at Evernym and the Principal Architect at Trust over IP, or ToIP. Drummond, could you provide a brief introduction into your technical and business journey within the field of privacy and trust?
You bet. I started down this road, I think as far back as actually almost 30 years ago. I was thinking about it this morning. It was 1991, working on problems around how we're going to do what I call wide area data interchange and exchanging data between since I was a computer consultant back then and helping clients on networks that were up and coming. I thought, how are we going to handle this? And it took me down a path into basically markup languages and early protocols. And I said, oh, this should be object oriented. And that took me into protocol design and all that. And sure enough, that landed me at the end of about 2001, it was, oh, well, if you can't really do that problem unless you solve, well, who's at the endpoints and how do you secure everything? And we came up with ways of doing that and started to, build a company around them. Back then, one of my first startups. And pretty soon I found, oh, everyone's calling that identity. That's digital identity. You're tackling digital identity. I never thought about it. It was just an aspect of this wide area data problem. Anyway, as that grew up and we realized we were tackling it, for large networks like the internet, and the internet was taking off, the web was taking off. Then I just got sucked into these what turned out to be this ongoing, pretty much if you think about it, the start of federated identity, what I call the three eras: the centralized identity, where we're all logging into a server someplace to have accounts on individual systems. That became so painful with the internet, we had to go to federated identity, where we're leveraging our account with one system to log into a bunch of others. But that also hit the wall we went through 3 generations of protocols. By 2015, it was like, that's not really going to solve the problem. And that's when the emergence of blockchain and the protocols and cloud and mobile computing said we could actually do this with digital credentials. That was the birth of decentralized identity. So with that, by that time, my second startup had been acquired by Evernym. So I joined the team there, building the first one of the blockchains designed to do that. And then the whole protocol layers on up to the digital wallets and the credentials above that. And that gave rise first to the Sovereign Foundation, where I was one of the founding trustees and the chair of the governance working group there. And then we said, finally, hey, let's standardize the whole stack for doing that. And that became the Trust over IP Foundation, where I'm one of the steering committee members there, and I chair 2 working groups: the governance stack working group and the concepts and technology working group. So I'm full-time in this decentralized identity, or SSI as it's widely called, industry today. It's almost 24 hours a day, Sanjay, as you know.
Wow, what a journey. If you put that railroad caboose, that's quite the train, pardon the pun. And so you and I met when you were the principal architect, again, for a protocol called the Pretty Good Privacy. I still remember it, or PGP, which was a pretty good product, again, pardon the pun. What was the reason for your moving that to open source? And you've been pretty much in the open source space for a long time. It is a big circle, as you say, and it is a pretty wide circle now, from privacy to identity to trust, and back all again in a full circle.
Yeah, well, let me just, so I was working on something that sort of grew out of PGP at Oasis called XDI. And PGP, that was started by Phil Zimmerman, and the guy who was heavily influenced by that, Christopher Allen, who became the chief architect of the SSL and now TLS, encryption protocol that we use on the web. He worked with Phil, and all of that. It was like, we need to basically find a way to do that in a more generalized way. And so that became our work at the OASIS standards body on XDI, Extensible Data Interchange. And that was that wide area data interchange protocol. And yes, my first company, we applied for a bunch of patents in that area, and we were sort of a conventional startup that says that's how you protect your intellectual property, and you try and and you gain investment that way, and we did. We raised a lot of money and did a lot of development. But what we realized, Sanjay, is infrastructure at scale, especially infrastructure that's going to be adopted like the internet, like the web. That whole base layer has got to be, well, specifically in the 4-layer trusted RP stack, layer 1's called public utilities, right? And you know how much pressure there is if you try and put a toll on a road, right? I mean, even today it's still, so toll roads on our digital transportation infrastructure, they just, those things don't get adopted broadly. So we just recognized we had to build value on top of that. And yeah, if you want to patent applications, things higher up in the application space, that'll work. But we really had to dedicate the infrastructure to open standards. You have to have open source for any modern open standard. You can have proprietary implementations, but open source is what builds the trust to actually adopt it and be sure it works.
Thank you. That quite the story. I didn't know the SSL connection there. I had the privilege of meeting Eric Young, who was SSLEAY, the libraries, very early libraries, through his, I guess, RSA initially, and then EMC days. But you also mentioned another good point, which is, you can't put a toll road. And I guess we've been through some of these things with the telecom folks and with the government as well. So coming back to the full circle of hyperledgers, side chains, blockchains, single chains, we could go there, not too deeply, but honestly, in a distributed world, you would require, you already mentioned this, some layer 1 and layer 2 distributed. I would call it a distributed operating system once you start thinking about it, to kind of connect it as a data system and include some kind of services. And you mentioned this as well. You called it a federated public layer. So what is your take on a service-based ecosystem for trust?
So again, when I refer to the trust over IP 4-layer model, I'm going to be very specific about the layers. The bottom 2 layers are about cryptographic infrastructure, cryptographic verifiability of actors and messages, but no human trust. It's how you establish cryptographic trust. The top 2 layers are about establishing human trust. And we break the bottom 2 layers. Layer 1 is how you're going to get strong cryptographic trust roots. And the aha that got us started down the road was to say that up until the third era of decentralized identity in federated or centralized identity models, those trust roots are centralized. They are certificate authorities. Like for our SSL TLS infrastructure today, they're roughly a couple hundred certificate authorities, and their root certificates are built into your browsers. It is 5 browser manufacturers that basically control the and accept and recognize the certificate authorities, and those are built into your browsers, and everything that's a root of trust for everything that comes out from that. That's not necessarily bad, but is that really how we want to build a trust infrastructure for all of digital economies and societies, right? So we recognize that that public key infrastructure that's based on centralized CAs needs to evolve, just like the internet had to come up and evolve and moved away from centralized networks that just worked one off, and the trust model was just one network at a time, to the internet. And we have to do the same thing for the trust model. So we said, well, what we need is decentralized public key infrastructures where you can use, and by the way, it's not restricted to blockchains. Blockchains are one good example of how you can do it. You can do it with decentralized file systems like IPFS. You can do it with, it's a superset of the centralized system. So you can use CAs, you can use directory system, Microsoft Active Directory, whatever you trust. But the point is, if you, and what we call the trust triangle up at layer 3, when you're issuing, holding, or verifying credentials, those issuers need to be able to have their public key widely discoverable and verifiable. And so that's what led to the development of the decentralized identifier standard, on which I've spent 5 years of my life. And it's almost at the vote is just being completed at W3C. And DIDs solve a simple problem. You take a key pair and you associate it with an identifier that's cryptographically verifiable as being, tied to that public key. And now you write that that DID and the what we call the DID document, the public key, and any other metadata to a verifiable data registry, a blockchain, a layer 1 public utility. And now any credential issued by that verifier, signed by the private key, they put the DID in the credential, and now any verifier can go, oh, I've never seen this before, but I can take that DID, I can look up the public key, and I can I can verify the signature, but I can also turn around and say, who knows about this DID? Can I trust that issuer? And so we've added this identity layer, fundamentally decentralized, added it to public-private key cryptography. And now with that as layer 1, as that sort of core system, shared service, as you call about it, we can now start working our way up to digital wallets and agents that are connecting at layer 2, the trust triangle, verifiable credential exchange at layer 3, and then whole what we call digital trust ecosystems at layer 4. And I think you're going to see, services and standardized protocols at all 4 layers.
Thank you. That was quite the ping pong diagram there, verbally, Drummond. I appreciate that. Also, thank you for mentioning that there is this machine or protocol layer of trust and human layer trust. There's always humans involved in the middle. And also educating the audience on the difference between hardware root of trust, software root of trust, browser root of trust versus a distributed trust engine, if you will. So sticking with the trust over IP side of the protocol side, you've been involved in the trust over IP side with the W3C for a long time now as well. Could you talk about your effort there and the cast of characters for that effort? Sure.
And let me clarify. So the 2 sort of foundational open standards for this new decentralized identity layer and era are at W3C. The first one is verifiable credentials, standardized digital credentials, and the signature formats, and now the decentralized identifiers to get down and do layer 1. But the innovation in sort of how the architecture for the space as a whole is evolving has actually taken place over in where I think a lot of sort of early standards activity is going, which is at the Linux Foundation.
Thank you.
And we have I think there are well over 300 projects now at the Linux Foundation, right? Since it, obviously we started around Linux. So I like to say their evolution has been 3 stages. Open source, that's what it was all about initially when it was founded. Then it became enough open source now is involved open standards. And they're not a standards body, but a lot of their projects now are generating pre-standards or early standards work that eventually it's either goes straight into use because it's just a smaller problem, or then it goes to a standards development organization like W3C or ITF or ISO. But now it's going to the 3rd stage, what we call open governance, which is they're actually putting together, projects whose job it is figure out a problem for a community. And what we're saying is, there's going to be a huge number of digital trust ecosystems that need that open governance. So when we sort of recognize, hey, we've got this 4-layer stack, and I'm going to talk about the other major feature, Sanjay, which is, as you've seen, it's 2 halves. It's a technology half, just like the TCP/IP stack, but unlike TCP/IP stack, it's a governance half. We said all 4 layers, you need governance frameworks, which are a superset of trust frameworks, to basically say, what are the policies by which a set of humans and organizations agree to use a layer, to agree to operate, right? A public utility at layer 1, or wallets and agents at layer 2, or credential governance like Visa and MasterCard style operating rules layer 3, or whole digital trust ecosystems at layer 4. So these 4 layers and these two halves, we said this is a it's more than an operating system. It is it's a trust layer for the internet, which is why it got called trust over IP. So it was basically a number of us that were involved. Sort of the core nexus was a Hyperledger projects that Hyperledger's, blockchain for business, and they're best known for business blockchains like Fabric. But what happened was those of us working on this new decentralized identity area, we said we need blockchain specialized for that. Evernym contributed to the Sovereign Foundation, and then contributed to Hyperledger, a code base called Hyperledger Indy, the project's Indy, for blockchains just to do this DID, solve this DID problem, this decentralized PKA problem. And that project caught on there in a big way. And it led to, well, how do we do the wallets and agents above that? And it's all building on that cryptographic base. So that then became a separate project called Hyperledger Ares. And the crypto all got pulled out into a project called Hyperledger Ursa. And pretty soon, Hyperledger became the sort of one of the centers of this development for SSI. And meanwhile, W3C, there was a community forming there. There's also projects in Europe that had coalesced into the European SSI identity framework. So all of those projects are moving along, and we said, hey, folks involved with all of them came together to say, hey, we now see this, what we call the trust ORP stack, this 4-layer, 2-half model, as being the DNA of a trust layer for the internet. Let's start an organization at the Linux Foundation just to basically get that together, define the stack, harden the stack, fill in any missing pieces, and then start sending off pieces as needed to the standards development organizations. Huge credit to John Jordan and his team at the province of British Columbia. He was the one who coined the term trust ORP and is still now the executive director. A fellow named Daryl O'Donnell, who is also another Canadian in Ottawa, has his own company, Continuum Loop, but he helped, write the original white paper. The other, Dan Gisolfi, who was at IBM, was like 34 years there, has since left to go to Discover, is still working on these things there. And Daniel Hardman, who was the chief architect here at Evernym, is now at SIGPA in Switzerland. And then Matthew Davey at Kiva, which, if you're familiar with Kiva, it's the world's largest microlending platform. Guess what microlending needs at scale?
Yep.
SSI, implemented at like entire countries. So anyway, those are a lot of, but many more folks are involved. And we're very close to sort of adjacent to other Linux Foundation projects like the Decentralized Identity Foundation. I was one of the original trustees there, Hyperledger, of course, and now Linux Foundation Public Health, and which has been very focused on COVID credentials. They have a project called the COVID Credentials Initiative, which is really help plowing the road for standardizing COVID credentials. So that's a long answer, but there was a lot of history.
Oh yeah, it's a lot of people involved. Yeah, and thank you for bringing Hyperledger. I've been involved in Hyperledger for about 7 years now, and there is a healthcare. You also brought up the public health part of Linux Foundation. So following your wordy answer, I'll ask a wordy question. So a couple of days ago, the UK government decided that it would not be doing vaccine passports. There was a news by the Health and Human Services that it was a couple of days ago again, that 50% of the hospitals in the United States cannot send information to CDC. Just simple stuff on trying to figure out, what's going on a daily, hourly basis, both for vaccine reporting and hospital capacity and things like that. So without the DID or the distributed ID community having this ecosystem of peers, orderers, and members, by the way, that comes directly from distributed learning and knowledge graphs, those terms, by the way.
Okay.
how do you think we would get to a threshold? And I kind of quote this very infamous threshold that's been mentioned hundreds of thousands of times, called the herd immunity threshold, which is somewhat farcical in my opinion, but that aside. So if you take that as the ecosystem and then add to it the very tough issues of physician credentialing, which in the United States, again, lies within the laps of the American Medical Association, and for patient credentialing, which is even a more complex effort that involves payers and providers, and of course, the US government, which means a national effort. Where I'm going with this long-winded question is, what do you think from a DID perspective and a trust over IP perspective, this threshold for success would be for sovereign identity and credentialing?
It's a very good question, and I'm going to lean heavily on an analogy that I think is more than just an analogy. It is a direct precedent for how adoption will work. What if I turned around and asked you the same question a good, say, 30 years ago or 25 years ago about how are we ever going to get all this health information into the hands of the doctors and nurses and everything we need it when it's all locked up in these systems that are, proprietary? And in other words, how are we actually going to get to this information on the web, right? And the answer then would have been, well, oh man, that's never going to happen, right? Well, of course it happened. The reason it happened is because it didn't have to happen in one giant step. Each individual system and group and community could say, oh, we need a website for this, right? Then we need a website for this. And then we start linking the things across the website. The information gets more and more valuable. And what enabled that to happen, organic growth, if you want to put it that way, was the standards, right? The browser could talk, each new website that came up, and it wasn't perfect. We all remember back then, it was like, okay, certain websites built to a certain browser didn't work with other browsers, or they, but we solved that fairly quickly. So I believe, I'm going to give you a very tangible example of that set of many, many complex challenges. And I believe the two biggest, richest areas for adoption of, actually, I'm going to say three, because I got to talk about travel, because travel, of course, is where, like I had a travel pass and COVID credentials being used now. But until that came along, the two leaders were surprise, financial services, where it's always needed. But the other one is healthcare. And it's healthcare because it's highly valuable information, like your life could depend on it. It's highly private information, and it needs to be shared very, very specifically, right? And so take one problem in that area, physician credentialing, take one ecosystem that needed to solve the problem. I'm going to point to the NHS in the UK, and one team behind that that's been working on the problem for quite a while and said, we think that, and actually two visionary doctors, one leader, Nijar, with a company, NHS doctors that said, we're going to solve the problem. And out of that comes the NHS Digital Staff Passport. And it is, it uses all of this technology, it uses all the privacy preservation things we built into it, and it is being used now. It's slowly, hospital by hospital. There's, as I understand, more than 1,000 of them in that system, but they are adopting it, and it's going to save them. Full adoption is like 40,000 doctor hours per year. That's pretty hard to argue with in terms of the value. Now already it's just, and that's just doctors and nurses having their credentials so they can move between hospitals and care facilities, right? Already others, they're saying, oh, well, now that we've got a digital wallet, we got credentials, let's start using it for these other things. And then it moves out to first patients, and then it moves, you see what I mean? It's organic adoption, and it's not going to happen overnight. The web didn't happen overnight, but it also does have an exponential adoption curve.
Thank you. Thank you for bringing up the NHS. My joke always is every trust in the NHS is its own sovereign, and all the physicians. I'm not joking. And all the physicians are consultants, even though we say it's a kind of a nebulous single entity. It's not. It's actually quite diverse. A little piece of information to add: the nudge from the U.S. government for the U.S. digital health records was a 7-year process. And there was both a carrot and a stick. The carrot was $40 billion, which actually ran out in the end of 2019. And then, the digital transformation kind of dropped off. But that incentive and the stick was, of course, the fines. So I think there is two sides of the fence there. But thank you for elucidating that point. My next question, not that wordy, but it has some detail in it. So my personal experiences with email security for things like DKIM, which is domain key identity management, MTSTS, which is mail transfer agent, STS is strict transport layer security, hashing, TLS, you mentioned certificate authorities. It's been a pretty steep learning curve for me. And I'm not a shy Linux guy. I become fairly good at it, but the learning curve was very steep, especially for automation. And there are keys everywhere. I have to manage separate keys for each of those. I use Let's Encrypt for an example for some of my keys, but these require some pretty serious skills, both on Linux and BSD and so on. So in your opinion, who manages these new set of keys that are going to be generated at some point? Who automates this? And is the world of trust over IP and identity going to be separate or the same? And how are they going to do it?
You're asking a question about, I think it's widely recognized, the core problem, and I would say it stretches the word usability, right? But the core challenge at the heart of the success of this decentralized identity space is key management, right? And some very, very esteemed cryptographers and cryptographic engineers like Bob Blakely what's Ben's last name at Google have said can't be solved. They're extremely skeptical it can be solved. And my answer back has been, well, I'm going to start with something. Sanjay, I assume you use some secure messaging chat products, right? Yep. You don't have to name the specific ones, but I'll name the ones I use, right? I use Signal. I do use WhatsApp with folks in the international space. I use iMessage and a couple others occasionally. Not really Telegram that much. It's too crowded. But anyway, all end-to-end encrypted messages. Okay. Do I worry about key management? Right?
Great point.
Exactly. Signal is the one app, and you know what they boil it down to? About every 2 weeks, they remind me to enter my passcode.
Yep.
Right.
I've used Signal for more than a decade, Drummond. So
Signal's fantastic. Now, I don't want to turn around and just dismiss it as, oh, look, they've handled key management. No, what I'm going to say is, when you put the engineering and UX effort into key management, that's gone into many other things like a modern browser, right? That I mean, that's the business companies like Evernym are in. I'm not gonna have it right here, but I'm gonna pull up and go, think of how much UX experience goes into the mobile apps we use, right? When you use a digital wallet today, any of the commercial wallets on the market, all they really have to do about key management is set you up for an encrypted backup, right? And even then, we're making that easier and easier, right? So all the key management will be handled by apps designed to do it. Now that's individuals, that's out at the edges. Enterprise key management, I can't tell you, Sanjay, how much work is now going in to doing that, because it's been recognized we really can only solve the problem, the trust problem on the internet, and get this whole layer if everybody is managing their keys. And we've made it part of the infrastructure just the way everyone today is managing information that's going on the web, and we're all managing our email, right? So anyway, that's the best answer I can give you in a short period of time. If you want to go deep, there's some chapters in here.
I've actually read the book.
Yeah.
Thank you for bringing that up. That was my next question, by the way, which is not just writing the book. It's called Self-Sovereign Identity. It's a great book. But if you were king or sovereign for a day or a month, how would you implement self-sovereign identity or SSI?
It's going to be the shortest answer I give you, okay? We started the Trust over IP Foundation because we said that's how to do it. And again, we're not using slides or visuals on this. When I'm presenting, I'm always, here's another picture. But I think my favorite newer picture is a visualization we've come up with, for why do we call it trusted IP? What does it actually look like? And Sanjay, I imagine most of your listeners on this, if I said, well, what does the internet look like, right? Basically, it's a bunch of devices out there, all of which are sending packets back and forth between each other, but it all works not just because of the routers in the center that are moving those packets. It all works because all those devices are running a little set of protocols, a little thing called the TCP/IP, TCP/IP stack, right? They know how to send and receive those packets. And if you don't know how to do that, you can't connect to the internet, right? The insight that led again to the full name and concept was to say, it's widely acknowledged. In fact, there's a fantastic Washington Post article, I'm trying to remember, we just cited it in a new paper we're doing for Trust over IP, that explains, well, why do we have all these security issues? It's because security was not in scope for the original product, the TCP/IP stack.
Even the email, by the way, SMTP wasn't crappy security.
Totally, and that's why we have spam, and that's why phishing is so bad, right? 5 times more cyber attacks originate through phishing than any other source, any other origin. So my answer is, guess what? We're designing the trust over IP stack. Trust over IP stack essentially, conceptually operates right on top of the TCP/IP stack. Any device, any person, any organization, anywhere will be able to engage now in trusted end-to-end communications using DIDs, cryptographically verifiable identifiers, and the protocol that's emerging for the IP of trust over IP is called DIDCOM. And it is secure messaging between any two devices. So that's the shortest answer I can give you to say that's the formula. It's going to work for everyone, governments on down to individuals and everything we're dealing with.
Yeah, I will add a link to the ToIP website and the two sides of the fence, the governance side and the stack side as well. That very nicely explains it. So we come to my last question, kind of in that same vein. With GDPR and data protection regulations getting stronger and stronger, and the Wild West of borrowing and stealing data, if I may say that, with weak consent is rapidly fading, especially in some countries. And also with the fact that there is no federal privacy laws in the US. And also with the new fact a couple of months ago that the privacy shield rider between the European Union and US went away. What is your take on the future of privacy?
This one, it's very hard to give a short answer for, although I will quote Ann Cavoukian, former Information and Privacy Commissioner of Ontario, that coined the concept of privacy by design. When I sat down with her at the very start of this year, and we were invited to be on a webinar together, she was going to give a keynote, and she said, Drummond, I really need to understand with Trust over IP and what you're doing, how SSI works, and what this means for privacy. So it took 3 sessions with her, and at the end she said, oh my God, this is how we can finally implement privacy by design at internet scale. And she's absolutely right. I said, Ann, can I put that quote on a slide that I use to introduce the section of my presentations where I explain how it's going to happen? And I'm thrilled to point out, Sanjay, the most government support for SSI architecture, and they call it that. They've just said, hey, we're just going to call it SSI. A lot of folks don't like the term self-sovereign identity. I'm not actually a huge fan of it. It's just that's what the market adopted. I just call it SSI now. But the biggest government-funded SSI projects in the world are in the EU, the home of GDPR, because, I mean, it doesn't get much better than individual control, not just of your data, but the keys you're using to digitally sign, secure, and authorize the use of your data. And one thing we point out in the book, and I try and bring up every time I can, is data in a giant database or data lake are the things that are getting hacked today that cause so much problem. If what's in there is either it's encrypted because you've done that and they've encrypted it, that's great. But even if that can be broken, if the use of that data is only it's only actionable if it's accompanied with cryptographically verifiable permission of the data subject, then stealing that data isn't going to mean anything. In fact, it's going to turn toxic, right? And we're literally finally, I mean, as uphill as it looks, we're going to be able to finally put an end to the era you're talking about of surveillance capitalism. And we're going to see not just the GDPR protections, but it's going to start to become the standard. John Jordan, again, the executive director of TrustRiver, calls it confidentiality by design. That's what we should be expecting with our data everywhere we're using it on the internet. And yeah, we're not going to get there overnight, but I am a huge proponent that we are going to get there, and invite everyone who's interested in that, come join us at TrustRiver IP, and let's get it built.
Thank you, Drummond. A couple of quick points. I think when I used to work in the quality space and did some validation verification as a consultant for the FDA, they used to call it quality by design. And it has to come from the top down, not from bottom up, from the CEO down, that is. And I hope that trust takes that direction, not just trust by design, but privacy by design, as you mentioned. And another piece of note, 2015, the US Supreme Court, and as a background to this, I'm a small L libertarian, not the Kentucky variety, but I think individual rights matter. And I think in 2015, the Supreme Court passed a law that said your genetic information belongs to you. It's called GINA, Genetic Information Non-Discrimination Act, I believe. And I think all of these, if we can employ these at scale, will be beautiful for healthcare. I'm selfishly asking that because I'm in the healthcare field. So in any closing thoughts? This has been wonderful, by the way. Thank you for explaining this in nice, crisp terms.
Well, since we're on healthcare, I will share the closing thought. I had the opportunity to do a webinar for, I won't name the organization, but it is a consortium of healthcare leaders, I'll put it that way, as organizations, saying, how do we come in and tackle some of these really hard problems that have been intractable in healthcare for a very long time? And it was exactly the things we've been talking about here with slides and all the explanation. And the reason I bring it up is because to me it's emblematic. I've already seen the proof of other areas, but this group was so engaged, I didn't get more than halfway through, because the light bulbs were just going on like paparazzi. They can see how the deeper the problem and the more important it is to solve that problem to a space, the more momentum this will gain. So, and I do believe, and I'm not a doctor, I'm just, I work with them, and I work with the healthcare IT specialists that want to do this. But I had several doctors invest in my startup that then was acquired by Evernym, and some have become very good friends because of how deeply they believe this is what they've been waiting for 20, 30, 40 years. To solve that aspect. It doesn't solve everything in healthcare, but the very hard problems of data interoperability, shared semantics, trust throughout the system, patient centricity of data, we can do a lot to do it. And it will take us a while, but I would love to see it succeed in healthcare more than any place in the world, because what actually impacts our lives more.
Yep. Thank you. I think putting a bow on this with healthcare makes me happy and smile. Thank you again for your time, Drummond. This was wonderful. I hope we could do this more often with probably a bigger panel of some very esteemed folks. Thanks again, and have a great day.
My pleasure. You bet. Thanks so much.